Hey, live from Austin, this is the Plutopia News Network. Our guest tonight is Glenn Smith, author, journalist, and senior strategist for ProgressTexas. The not ready for cable news players are here: John Lebkowski, some guy named Scoop Sweeney, Maggie Duvall, and our designated driver for this happy hour, Susie Sheeler.
Hello, hello. Thanks so much for being here, Glenn. I appreciate it. I feel like I just saw you.
Proud to be here.
I just wanted to do a little bit more introduction for you, for our audience. Glenn Smith has spent the past 40 years in journalism and in politics, where he's made a name for himself as a writer, campaign manager, activist, think tank analyst, and, as Daily Kos founder Marcos Mulitsa says, a legendary political consultant and all-around good guy. Smith helped lead Ann Richards' successful 1990 campaign for governor of Texas. He worked for former Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby and U.S. Senator Lloyd Bentsen. As a senior fellow at George Laskoff's prestigious Rockridge Institute in Berkeley, he studied, wrote, and taught on the power of metaphor and narrative in political communications. Smith is currently a senior strategist for ProgressTexas. He writes a bi-weekly column for Austin American-Statesman and the weekly column for the Quorum Report, which is Texas' leading political newsletter. Thanks so much for being here. Did I forget anything?
Oh, no, you probably went on too long.
No,
thank you so much.
So I wanted to ask you, I'd like to discuss a few things with you. I saw on social media today you were talking quite a bit about the coronavirus. Mm-hmm. And did you want to just say anything just about that? That seems to be on your mind today. I've noticed a little bit, but I also wanted to discuss voting and
sure.
And really primarily the voting issue. But go ahead.
The governor had a press conference this afternoon, early afternoon, and on efforts against or about coronavirus. In his case, I'm not sure how much against it actually is. He focused on this, which I think is misleading and even dangerously so, where he says, well, everything's okay because our hospital capacity is fine. But let's talk about us individually. Now, because the personal contacts of everybody in our community are way up, they are exposed to more and more people, meaning that they have a higher and higher chance of being infected. And because they do, when we go places they have been, our risk is way up from where it was 2 months ago. It doesn't have to do with the availability of hospital beds. That is not a factor in our risk level. And what I fear is that the way Governor Abbott puts it is he misleads people into thinking all's clear. You know, the bomb threat is over. We can return to life as normal. And we can't. So I worry that he's actually promoting unnecessary risk, health concerns, and even deaths by not being more clear with the people of Texas.
Right.
Well, and also that whole thing about the hospital bed capacity, the beds could fill up in Houston and there could still be a lot of beds available in other parts of the state. So are you going to have to travel across the state to get into one of those hospital beds? And then the other point is that those beds could fill up really fast if we have an exponential growth in the number of hospitalizations.
No, that could happen. I mean,
yeah.
And in fact, if we keep telling people it's an all clear, go ahead and gather in crowds and don't wear masks and don't wash your hands. It will happen. I mean, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Abbott's just come out and said that it was the young kids' fault for going out in public and not being careful. He said he's just put out a statement that it was the kids' fault, the young people's fault for not being careful. But I feel like we've been following we've been following the guidelines. So I'm not sure that has anything to do with it. I think, haven't we all been careful? Isn't this just the natural progression of this virus?
Well, I think it was something covering my guy. As far as I know, and I watch all of his public events, especially regarding this, today was the first day I ever saw him in a mask. So I'm not sure whether he includes himself in that category of young people or not, but I never saw him wear a mask in a room full of people until today. So
he thinks he's Zorro.
Wow.
He didn't wear it across his eyes out there. Anyway, so yes, we have done pretty well. And I think we're going to have to do even better, however, because I think he sent these mixed signals that are letting people believe that everything's okay, and it's not. So people have loosened up, and they're not as careful as they were a couple of months ago because they're getting a signal that it's okay not to be. And that's not just young people. I mean, come on.
Right.
I mean, it's such an easy finger to point. It's ridiculous.
That's
Yeah.
what's known as the Scooby-Doo plea, those meddling kids. And that's about as lame as you can get. Glenn, what do you think the outcome of the state Republican convention is going to be? Catastrophe or disaster?
Well, are you speaking about the politics that follow from it, or just the
Just overall?
potential for, first of all, in your Scooby-Doo metaphor or analogy, I'll just go rut-row and say that, yes, I think that gathering of thousands of people at the convention center in Houston poses many, many, many dangers to the public health. I mean, basically, that convention will be full of the anti-masker contingent, because the delegates to that convention seem to come from the far right, and they're the ones that said wearing a mask, ordering them to wear a mask was an infringement on their personal liberty. So I would expect it to be a situation more dangerous than some other gatherings, even more dangerous than our recent demonstrations on behalf of racial justice, where most people were wearing masks and being as careful as they could be.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And that seems to be a big point of attack right now for people who don't want to wear a mask. Well, look at the protesters. Well, look at them. They're wearing masks.
Just please do.
Yeah.
You know, that brings me back to something else that Abbott has said in recent days. It's actually it's 180 degrees off. It's upside down. It's backwards. Whatever you want to say, is to say wearing a mask is a matter of personal liberty, but the mask does not protect the wearer's health. It protects others' health. So
Right.
as I said on another show recently, it's as if Abbott was saying, we don't have a law against brandishing a weapon, which is against the law in Texas, which is what not wearing a mask actually is. You're brandishing a weapon. It happens to be yourself, but you wear a mask to protect other people, not to point the loaded gun of a possible infection with a deadly virus. So he sort of reverses that and makes the mask seem like it has to do with one's personal risk taking, but it's not. It's about other people, and that should be made clear.
It's like drinking and driving.
Kind of, it is. Absolutely.
What do you
Or
think
pointing a gun at someone.
Yeah.
What do you think about the the upcoming Tulsa rally for Trump and the disclaimer signing? That's something I've never encountered in any kind of event like that.
For a guy that says that if we didn't have tests, there wouldn't be a virus. It is sort of like if we didn't go get cancer tests, there'd be no cancer. It'd be a miracle. I mean, I don't know.
If we didn't have tests, I'd have a doctorate.
That's pretty good. I'll congratulate you on that. So yeah, he sort of betrayed where he's really coming from when his campaign, in order to try to avoid some legal responsibility, they said, we disclaim all responsibility for any diseases you might catch at our event. I mean, they're already catching Nazism. So I'm not sure what the disclaimer or the indemnity against disease is going to, can really accomplish in that circumstance. But once again, I'm being flipped. It's a very, very dangerous situation. He's going to ask people to come to the crowd. They're not going to wear masks. They're going to cheer and whoop and holler and scream, which projects many, many more little droplets of moisture into the air, which hang in the air for minutes and even hours. And I sure wouldn't go there.
Well, the odd thing was that they've never asked anybody to sign a disclaimer about the possibility that they would get mental illness at one of those rallies. And that possibility has manifested itself for the last 3 years, or 4 years, really.
I thought that was a prerequisite for going.
Yeah, maybe it'd be necessary to get the ticket. You have to that's kind of like catch 23 or something, I guess, right? If you're insane enough to go, you're already insane, something like that.
We'll talk about insane. Mail-in voting seems to be either a communist plot or something similar, according to our governor and pretty much all of his party. Am I missing something? Is it not? Is it really a communist plot to overthrow the government?
No, I mean, many states do universal mail-in ballots, and it works great. In fact, recently in Iowa, it worked better than without it, where they had universal mail-in ballots. They got counted quickly. It worked beautifully. There were no problems. Excuse me. No, it is a fact that it makes voting easier. And that's the last thing Republicans want, right? And that's not a new story. That's an old story. Lower voter turnout, their voters go, they suppress the vote of those they feel will be against them. And they need that circumstance in order to keep power. And that's what this is all about. Mm-hmm. No matter what they say, it is about suppressing the vote. They don't want everybody to have an easy mail ballot access to the polling place.
And as we saw in Georgia, they shut down. I mean, that was just insane what happened there, the primary there, or the run through. Did they not know that those polls were going to be closed? I mean, I recognize that they didn't realize that the machines weren't going to work and they weren't going to have the learning how to use the machines. But I mean, were they just closed polls? People showed up and they were not open?
I think they showed up and the machines weren't working, or in some cases that were old polling places that had been closed. I mean, it just creates a sort of disarray that people can get frustrated. But I will say two things about that. One, the turnout turned out to be, people waited. People brought umbrellas because it was storming in many places. They brought lawn chairs to sit in. They waited hours to vote. I had some recent evidence from some focus groups done in Texas on that matter of motivation to vote, and basically to vote against Trump. It's over the top.
Okay.
I mean, I never saw results like this from multiple groups across demographics where people are saying, we'll crawl across broken glass to vote. They can't keep me from voting. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to vote. I mean, it is more enthusiasm than I have ever seen. And I think people are undaunted. They can try their suppression techniques. I don't think it works this time, as we saw in Georgia. I don't think it worked.
Well, in the last vote, I was in awe of the voter turnout. People waiting hours and hours in line up here in near Arboretum. You know, I was just I'd never seen that before. So, you know.
No, I think it's going to be a repeat. I'm afraid of the chaos. I'm afraid of created chaos. I'm afraid of seeing, those unmarked, unbadged police officers like we just saw in D.C. showing up at critical polling places and just to scare people. Republicans have done that before.
Yeah.
In the long distance past, they put volunteers in fatigues that made them look like Border Patrol or local police and had them walk up and down and try to intimidate people.
Well, and you got those militia groups too. All the militia groups think that, it's their job to come out and,
I'm a little worried about that. I mean, if Trump goes into this election and the polls show him, 15 points down, what lengths will he go to create chaos and disrupt the election? I'll keep my eyes open for that.
This makes me think about our little project. I guess it's 16 years ago now. Glenn, you remember that we were telling people to capture videos if they saw any funny business at the polling places, and we built a site where they could upload the videos.
I do remember that.
That seems almost quaint now.
It does. It does, doesn't it? Because now they don't have to post them in any single place, really. But the thought was right, and we're actually seeing in terms of the drive for racial justice and the end of police killings at the moment how big a difference it can make to have video of these tragic events immediately available to the world. I mean, it makes a huge difference.
It's almost like we have a legion of citizen journalists out there, just people that just happened upon something that didn't look right and took video. And there, it wasn't that long ago that was very unusual. Now it's unusual when something weird happens and there aren't like a half a dozen videos. That's
very, very true. And I think it's actually, working for openness, transparency, and even sort of pro-democracy. And so, I fear, there's another way of looking at it. It's like the surveillance state. It's like the people have turned their own eyes on the surveillance state, right? It's like we're now watching them. And I wonder how long before they actually move against it, like China has tried to move against it more than once, I fear that.
There's
But right
actually a
now, it's
word for
working out.
that. It's called surveillance, SOUS valence. And there was a guy named Steve Mann years ago at MIT. I think he's still around, but he was famous for wearing a lot of technology, wearable technology, before anybody ever even thought to, 2 decades ago. And he came up with this idea of surveillance, where you're surveilling the surveillance state. And, he was far ahead of his time with that. Of course, it's the common thing now.
It's a great thing too. I hope it just grows and grows.
We definitely need it. So we postponed our election here until July, right?
Mhm.
So are you nervous that Trump is going to try that same thing in the national election? Is that a possibility that he would try to either postpone or just, either way, he has to leave the next day, right? If he doesn't win.
Well, there's so many. No, I don't believe he could actually pull that off. I think he would try to disrupt it ahead of time, or maybe cause such chaos, or God help us, hope that the pandemic is so out of control that it's just impossible for people to vote. But I really do think that would be it's like a filmic. It's like a Hollywood. It's like, what the heck happens if you really have a guy that just decides he's done with American democracy, and what does the military do? In my own opinion, the military doesn't stick with him at that point. They're already abandoning him in many ways, and so I don't think he could pull it off. He may try, because who knows? Certainly, I can make no argument that he won't go outside the law to accomplish his goals, because he seems to do it about every half hour so far over these 3.5 years. So, but I just don't think he could pull it off if he tried.
That would, if I calculate correctly, if he did that, he would still have to leave office on the 21st or the 20th, and Pelosi would be the president.
Yes, I think you're right. I think really the other thing, I think that Trump will be moving, if he loses the election, which I believe he will, by the way, I think he will move faster than people can calculate to save his money. He loves the power, but I don't think he wants to put what's left of his money at risk, because I think that's his first love, and it's really his only love, is himself and his money. So I don't think he pulls anything like that, because I think he would ultimately put all of his wealth, whatever remains of it, and his family at risk. I don't think he'll do it.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, back to the subject of the military, I was impressed by the number of very high-ranking retired and still active duty officers that have refused to compromise what has been their longstanding, oath to defend the country and not the president. And one would hope that they continue with that. But that's one of the things that was always threatened. Even in the last election, there were all these right-wing groups that were posting pictures of all these heavily armed men saying, if he doesn't win, we'll be seeing you on the streets. And one would hope that doesn't happen.
For the most part of my life, first of all, I think you're right about the military, as we've said. And I believe their allegiance to the ideas of American democracy is absolute in the end. We may have different ideas about the scope and our international positions, but about defending American democracy and their loyalty to the Constitution above a single leader, I really trust it, frankly. I do worry that the country as a whole has taken it for granted so long, and that a demagogue can exploit, social upheaval and fear and do just enough to tip us over to the other side. I do worry about that. It has worked to some degree with a healthy, 30% probably of the American electorate at the moment that seems there's nothing Trump could do that would make them fall off. And they seem finished. Really, Bill Barr is finished with democracy. He's the Attorney General of the United States. And he doesn't really even hide it anymore. It is no, we need an executive above the law. And we don't really need Congress except sort of like as a show thing. And we don't have to cooperate with anything Congress does. And we don't even like the courts unless they do what we say. I mean, I think that's Bill Barr.
Why do you think he believes that? I mean, I know what he's saying that makes you believe it, but I'm thinking, what do you think is going on in his head that he could believe that?
Well, from my years in Berkeley with Lakoff, I'll tell you, it has to do with a sort of worldview that comes with the way people are raised in a family setting. And in this case of the more authoritarian worldview, it is that the world is very hierarchical. And it doesn't really matter what the excesses of authority are.
Yeah.
The hierarchy is way more important to maintain than to correct the excesses of the authority. So he is with that mindset, and he is very hierarchical and believes it should be an unchecked, unaccountable authority at the top, much like, you know, a strict father, as Lakoff put it, in a family that can't question his authority or even his abuses. And I think that's where Bill Barr and others come from.
Is there an argument for that?
Well, it's certainly, you know, it's funny. It's natural to human nature, I'm afraid, that hierarchical authoritarian view. But it's really interesting that anthropologists have, over time, looked back at earlier cultures and figured out that at the same time, like especially as we move from hunter-gatherers to a little bit larger groups, there were profound local checks on that authority. They called it the bully at the time. And if the guy began to hoard too many of the group's goods or mistreated others in the group, exile was one solution, and the group would come together in a much more egalitarian spirit and get rid of the bully or the hoarder. And as we got into bigger and bigger societies, that's sort of, we lost the ability to do that. So the answer to your question is we have both inside of us. We have a profoundly egalitarian, communitarian, empathy-driven relationship to those around us. But there's also this sort of drive for hierarchy, sort of clear authority to, you know, get us across the river when we need it.
If Barr wants to make that happen, he's got the wrong guy carrying the ball for him, doesn't he?
It's sort of surprising, yes, but I guess he's thinking, you know, in any port in a storm, right? So he's got him there, and Trump's going to listen to him, and he get as far as he can, advancing that, you know, and move as far to the right in the Trump area as he can, and hope that he doesn't wind up in prison himself, which is not altogether out of the question, by the way, in concerning some of Barr's, you know, behavior. But I imagine he's an opportunist. He's going to move us as far as he thinks he can move us, given the circumstance of working for, you know, a guy like Trump.
Glenn, I was really moved by your column yesterday. I believe it was in the Statesman. You were writing about Václav Havel and the Polish revolutions. Could you tell us more about how that impressed you and how important that might be to this country?
Well, John may remember, because my discussions about Havel go all the way back to the time when we were doing the well and stuff like that, John. But so I'm going to tell the story really quickly. In the Charter 77 movement in Czechoslovakia, they had the ingenious idea to just hold the Czech regime at the time, the Soviet-backed regime, to its own words, and it had signed the Helsinki Accords, which made human rights a fundamental. And all that they did was say, live up to your statements. And it didn't work at the time. In fact, Havel's own mentor, philosopher named Plutopia, died in interrogation. The thing put off, but ultimately it won by sticking to their guns about, you know, as we've heard many times, living in truth and speaking truth to power. Those phrases emerged from that milieu. But on top of it, and what that column was about, was they were about restoring trust among people, because they could see that the authoritarian strategy was to destroy trust among people. Like, it really doesn't bother the Bill Barrs of the world that trust breaks down between police and citizenry. In fact, it works to his advantage in that playbook. So that restoring trust in the larger sense among all of us in the community is essential if we're going to restore it between the police and the community, or the political leadership or the city council or the school board or one another. We have to recognize that the authoritarians, those who want to control us, it's at the top of their to-do list. Destroy our trust in one another and make us believe that only they, as Trump said, only I can fix this. So what he means by that is don't trust one another. You'll betray one another. You need me to take care of it, and make sure. And we have to resist that.
Speaking of that, the SCOTUS, or not SCOTUS, it was a California decision that just came down about sanctuary cities today. Is that today that happened?
I didn't see it. I don't know.
That they can retain their sanctuary city status. How does that affect us? Because I know Abbott really doesn't. He's really trying to overrule our city council, which, hey, is not my favorite group, but I mean they're ours, And why would we have one if we're just going to let the state do everything?
Well, I don't know the jurisdiction of that court's ruling in California, whether it applies nationwide at the moment. I just don't know that. I mean, on the issue of sanctuary cities, I mean, I think, believe it or not, I think we'd have been better off if we'd have never employed that term. If we just executed on the strategies that it called for without giving it such a attackable ID, right? So that locally we don't turn our police and deputies into INS agents, or we don't have them become federal police that are harassing citizens on the street. That goes back to the trust question. As you heard, those that have resisted, and really the idea was as much, it was about compassion and recognition of the humanity of everybody, the dignity of everybody, but it was also about keeping communities safe. Because as soon as you turn to people that look a certain way and say, we may harass you to check and see if you've got the papers you need to have to be here, then you lose all sense of trust and cooperation in regular law enforcement issues, because nobody wants to talk to law enforcement because they fear they'll be hauled away. And that's another issue of trust in the end. And maybe we'd been better off if we'd have just fought it on community trust from the very beginning.
That's like defund the police. That is not the best choice of moniker for hashtag. People just jump on what they think it means.
What actually happened here was the federal appeals court had found that the California law for sanctuary cities, that the Trump administration could not rescind that. The theory being that the administration could not commandeer state governments to take actions they oppose. And I just wonder if that would also apply to the governors and cities. Do the governors really have the right to tell cities what laws they can pass or what they can require?
That's an interesting question. The ALEC, the right-wing think tank that writes a lot and recommends a lot of right-wing legislation for state legislators, started that campaign among Republicans against cities across America that have been turning Democratic faster than we can count, frankly. And they argued that most home rule city laws and other laws, that states actually create the authority of cities so they can take it away if they want. Now, in practice, that's not how democracy in America has evolved whatsoever. In fact, it goes the other way. And sometimes Republicans have argued exactly the opposite, that all power is local and it starts there, and we only in the state have any power because the locals are gracious enough in practice to give it to us. Look, it's no secret. Cities have turned blue. Cities are leading the charge on the demographic change across America. The all-white Republican Party is looking at these dynamic cities, which, by the way, are responsible for economies when it's working. And they're looking at them and going, oh, my God, those are all Democratic voters. We got to gut their power, or we're going to lose ours. And that's what the war on cities is all about.
And incidentally, that appeals court was an older ruling, but the Trump administration had taken it to the Supreme Court. And what happened, I think, yesterday was that the Supreme Court refused to hear it.
Okay. Is that what it was?
They refused to step in, yeah.
That's some good news. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, one of the things I was dealing with today, because among others, I assisted, by the way, speaking of a young, dynamic new leader in Texas, the chief executive of the Harris County, which is Houston, Lena Hidalgo. I'm proud to say I was like her crazy uncle mentor through her election. She came to see me. She was 26 years old, and I was so impressed. I just gave her free advice through the campaign, and she won by guns.
Right on.
So I've been working with her and others today on this issue because the governor has taken away the authority of locals to cope with the spread of the virus, you know. Mm-hmm. And in so many ways, that is our public health system was by and large, the frontline workers were all organized locally in local governments, right? So they were the frontline workers that had to be the first information collectors and the first treatment frontline. And what Abbott and the other Republican governors have done is they've destroyed that frontline ability to respond by saying, no, we know best. In fact, they, in no case so far that I found, did they know best. In Florida, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Texas, and now in Arizona. Actually, the Republican state takeover of locals' ability to cope with the virus has proved to be a disaster. And it is a disaster.
So do you think that coming back locally again to the state, do you think that we can beat Cornyn, that Texas may even go blue?
Oh, I think, you know, everything's pointed in the right direction. I mean, everything has to fall into place, and there's so many unknowns. This may be the hardest election of all time, my lifetime, to predict. So putting a lot of caveats on it, but all the signs are really pretty good. Trump, I mean, Abbott's numbers aren't as great as they could be. His handling of the COVID thing is sort of caused a lot of unsettling sentiment among voters you would expect to be for him. Trump is widely disliked, and among those voters we most need to first take back the state house with I think we need 9 challenge race wins and defend the 12 we won last time. And if we pull that off, we'll be in charge of the state House of Representatives, which would be huge. Cornyn's an interesting case. You know, I joke about Cornyn. He's actually a miracle man. You know why he's a miracle man?
Why?
He is at the same time a stuffed shirt and an empty suit. And that's really that's really hard to accomplish. You know? So his rep here in Texas hasn't been all of that. You know, he's just tied his wagon to Trump, and he hopes that's enough to pull him across the finish line. He's got nothing to show for his years in the Senate. He's a cipher to most Texans. His numbers aren't all that good. If things go right, he could lose, and we could turn Texas blue from the top. I mean, it's a definite possibility. I mean, he's going to have a lot more money than whether it's Royce West or MJ Hager. But nonetheless, we've climbed that hill before, and we could well do it again.
Oh gosh, that's fantastic. That's really something to look forward to.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm not so much at the track handicapping this race as I am giving it, like, I'm telling you, all the signs look great. I mean, are the resources available to Democrats in Texas are better and better organized than we've had really since the 80s, probably, relatively speaking. So I'm hopeful.
Well, Glenn, why do you think Republicans have such a hard time with educated people? I was just reading about the Texas Education Association deciding all that money from the government is going to stay with them or with the state and won't be shared with the local school districts. It just seems like they suddenly decide, well, you're smart enough. We'll spend this money somewhere else.
That's kind of a funny question, because I think the answer is really sort of obvious why they don't want intelligent people, because we toss them out on their butts if they were all smart. But there's another thing going on, which is like they view part of it's racial. Let's just be honest, right? Like they want their apartheid-like privilege, and so they don't mind educating the children of privilege. It's other children they don't see need to be taught to compete, and so they don't want to spend the money to teach them to compete. And it's pretty raw and pretty sad, but that's where they are. And they also got carried away over the years with a sort of anti-tax, that no taxes are good, that no government service is good. So that includes public schools and public colleges and universities. We shouldn't spend money on that anymore. It should all be privatized, and let's save our tax money so we can move to Dubai when it hits the fan.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's those things combined, and they've mounted a hasty and awful campaign against public education, which could be argued as what made American democracy possible, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Trump keeps talking about building up infrastructure, but last time I checked, that's paid for by taxes. So it's
that's true too. But he wants a private-public partnership. But he may be the first president in history who recommends an infrastructure that ends in a dead end. Like it's like the bridge to nowhere and the dead end of Trump's infrastructure projects. I mean, every week, remember that number of weeks we was going to have infrastructure week, and then it all fell apart. But the serious answer to your question, he was wanting private investment. Like the equivalent here was the toll road idea, right? We have privates build a road and then charge us to drive on, and that was Trump's idea about infrastructure. They'd build a dam and then charge everybody downstream for the protection of the dam, or they'd build a bridge and then charge everybody that wanted to cross the bridge. It wasn't going to be so much public money, I don't believe.
You think he would have paid attention to what happened to Governor Perry and all of his fine toll roads and fees. That didn't go over too well in the long run.
Not even on the right, did it? Because the right got convinced that we were going to have this secret damn highway from Canada down to Mexico. And, I couldn't follow either one of those things. The reason for that highway or the opposition to that highway.
I live in the home of Jade Helm, so I know all about those kind of conspiracies.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow, that was crazy.
And they were convinced that all those troops were going to be using that toll road to move them down to the concentration camps, et cetera, et cetera.
Scoop was a general within the Army.
Well, speaking of the divisiveness and speaking of conspiracies, I've been a little bit alarmed at how many people I know that have been traditionally more of a progressive bent have been going off the deep end into all kinds of conspiracy theories, and it's alarming. I mean, just like overnight. So that's a concern I have with the upcoming election too. Do you have any thoughts on that, Glenn, or any notice what you've noticed?
When people are fearful or anxious, even in our private lives, we begin to connect dots that really shouldn't be connected, right? We begin to think our significant others are plotting against us, or not paying them for not washing the dishes when they should. It's a conspiracy against drying out my hands.
It's actually happening in my case. But.
But it's true. When we're fearful and anxious, conspiracy kind of comes natural to humans because we want to see a understandable landscape around us, and so there's a lot of fear and anxiety right now for a variety of reasons. The pandemic, Trump, the climate crisis, for crying out loud, which we haven't touched on yet. I mean, people are fearful and they begin to try to create some certainty in front of them. The solution to that, once again, at the end of that article, I think it's a good place to put this. When Trump was elected, I discovered really quickly that this wasn't just a normal loss among progressives or Democrats. People that I meet with and talk to all the time were traumatized in a real way. So
perfect word.
I didn't want to talk to him in normal political pattern because I didn't think it would get the job done because it was a deeper cut than that, and it was obvious. So I spoke to physicians and doctors I know, and a guy gave me his medical textbook from Johns Hopkins, and I talked to a therapist that I'd seen years ago, and I put all their advice together, and there's 3 steps. And the first step, which kind of, by the way, is just one way of cutting through the habit of conspiracy thinking, maybe among other anxiety-driven things. The first step is acknowledge the feelings are real. Don't pat them on the head or tell them they're nuts if the situation's not what they see them, because our feelings are real. Thoughts may not get the reality of our life accurate, but the thoughts are real. We have to appreciate it and acknowledge it, or we can't open our hearts and minds to go further in helping. The second one as I put in that column too, was tell the truth, no matter what, tell the truth. Do not lie and deceive. Do not say that X is Y or 1 is 2. Tell the truth, even if it doesn't all add up where you want it to go, because trust is going to depend on the truth. And if you don't tell the truth, you're not going to gain the necessary trust to make for an emotional bond that could help keep us together. The third reason was the most interesting, and it was so interesting that it came from doctors who had to deliver the bad news of terminal illnesses to families and patients. And it might be obvious to all of us who've gone through therapy, but I hadn't thought of it in a political context. And it would be, it's to get people to hope again, say, recognize that they may be in a hopeless situation, may be really hopeless at the moment. But instead of tackling that, you say to them, if you could hope, what would you hope for? So you change the narrative pathway opportunities for them to think differently, right? So if you could hope, what would you hope could be done? And
like
those three steps are a really great way to, they are as important to me as what I learned from Lakoff at Berkeley about framing and language. I mean, in the I don't know what you call the social psychology sense of politics in America at the moment.
That's brilliant. That's fantastic. I like that. That's like tangible, practical advice, you know, in my world.
Well, I mean, I solicit. I didn't invent it. I got it from doctors and psychologists.
Yeah,
you know, they're the ones that have to give that ultimately practical, you know, life-giving advice, and that's why I look to them.
Yeah, but that addresses, you know, the thing that in conversations like we're all having with our friends, you know, feeling like I don't know what to do next. I don't know which way to turn. So it addresses that as well. And I led a group of friends through a little exercise where we had to resolve a ridiculous sort of problem, you know, adding the humor back into it, but like the most absurd problem you could think of. And then you were just given like a box of chocolate, some lace doilies, some palettes, and, you know, some other stuff. And everybody just got creative and just kind of got themselves out of the, you know, thinking the same way. And we had a really fun time and people came up with all these fabulous solutions. So I really appreciate that, because that's the same kind of idea in my mind. That sounds
like a great practice too. I mean, we should do more and more of that in our groups.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Oh, totally.
We all need some mental health right now. I think, and I've said it several times, I think we're all going to have some collective PTSD from this whole thing. But I also think it's not a bad idea to take, 6 months off every 100 years to let the earth heal itself, because, oh my God, there are dolphins in the Venice canals. You know, that's crazy just because people haven't been around.
You know,
it's kind of beautiful.
It's really hard. It's hard to figure out what to make of a phenomenon like QAnon is a really good example, kind of getting back to conspiracy theories. And the fact that this thing has been spreading, and the fact that people who seem to be reasonably sane are buying that thing, you know, and they're actually starting to spread the word of Q. And from what I've been able to gather, from what I know of what is coming through those Q drops, it's pretty crazy stuff, you know. Going back to that like pizza parlor episode when the guy showed up at the pizza parlor with a gun, looking for the basement that wasn't there. And I think part of the problem with at the origination of things like that is that they're kind of like whispered conversations. They're kind of hidden from view. They're happening in emails, or they're happening in obscure channels of networks and that sort of thing. And by the time you're aware of them, it's sort of like, you know, the little fire that grows and grows until it's a wildfire and out of control. And that seems a little bit that way. I mean, I've actually talked to people who I actually know and who I think are grounded people, you know, and then they start talking about QAnon stuff. It's mystifying, and I don't really know how to address it. I don't know how to, I mean, I don't know the best way to subvert that thinking, huh?
Well, it's like you have to deprogram the cult. I mean, and I will tell you the secret. I think, to them is really insidious, which is it comes with this actually implanting in the brains that any contrary evidence is immediately alien and enemy. You know, it's like, so it's almost there at the start. But we're going to tell you this, and anybody that contradicts us is the very reason we're going to help you in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So that no matter how reality might really confront them, they view it as the enemy attacking what they have come to believe in.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to, I mean, we know like code deprogramming can take a long, long time. And I don't really mean to belittle or insult. Everybody's got Buddha nature. Everybody's a child of God, but these people are lost, and it's sometimes hard to bring them back home. And we got to try, but you know, sometimes it doesn't work.
It's an example of the drowning person grasping at straws. Anything, you know, when they've lost all hope, they'll just grab at anything.
Right. You know, it's so when John, when you ask, you know, how do we, the best way to do is to try to like make sure we're communicating to those that have not joined the cult yet, right? And make sure they see it for what it is, and again, and try to safeguard them. It's not new. That's also not new to human nature. You know, I mean, people have believed and acted on all kinds of crazy ideas. Who was that group in Southern California that killed themselves thinking a spaceship was going to take their souls away?
With the white tennis shoes.
Yeah, I mean, we're prone to it. I myself continue to believe that the Houston Astros didn't cheat and steal the signs, but you know, I've been corrected. I got deprogrammed.
Yeah, they lost me when Clemens lied in front of Congress. It just broke my heart.
That was tragic.
It was. It really was. That's when I stopped watching baseball. So do you think that do you think getting, because Scoop mentioned the mail-in ballots, and that's something I wanted to ask about as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of talked to you about this a little bit the other day. Do you feel confident? Well, first of all, tell me the story about getting your mail-in ballot sent to you.
Funny, right? Okay, I do have to tell this. So I got a piece of mail from the current DA, Margaret Moore, just a piece of regular election mail that we all received at election time. But across the bottom, it said, "You can vote by mail." And I looked at it and I was like, I even started calling people. Like, the Travis County DA is sending the signal that she will not prosecute anybody who votes by mail, regardless of whether they have a disability or they're not 65 years old. I was thrilled to see it. And then it occurred to me, this is the first election in which I was 65. And that mail was targeted to me. So it really wasn't a general piece of mail. It was sent to me because she knew I was eligible to vote by mail. So I can, you know, my heart, I'm still like 39. But
I feel your pain. I received the one from Bastrop County, and I was very offended at them reminding me of my advanced age.
That was pretty funny. If I hadn't called people, then I then had to call back and go, "Oh man," I didn't have to like confess my actual age and say I've made a mistake. The DA doesn't appear to be as enlightened as I wish she was. But
if only. But I've heard. Okay, so I feel like there's sort of this mission to undermine our faith in the voting system. I think it's been going on for a long, long time, but I think it's really been ramped up since 2016. The rigged thing, and it's rigged even if he wins or loses or if whatever. And one of the things that I've heard was about mail-in ballots being problematic because sometimes they don't get counted, they get refused. And you made a point about that versus going and voting in person. And what you said, you think it's safer to vote by mail.
It's a paper ballot, you're right, and so it's harder to have like a line of code in an electronic voting machine that say tosses every third Democratic vote. We never know it. I mean, paper ballots. As long as many of us have been stumping for paper ballots or paper receipts to our votes since they introduced the digital electronic voting machines. Every kind of voting has some sort of, there's always going to be some risk or danger with any system you come up with.
Right.
But basically, people have a copy of the ballot they turned in, and if that ballot if a race is close enough to where it gets contested, you have an easy record of how you voted, and you can check that ballot against the ballot that is counted or not counted. So it's easier to get to the bottom of it if there is some discrepancy. And I think that's the number one. It limits intervention in our election by outside interlopers like Russia, because they're not going to fill out my application for a mail ballot or my ballot. They can't get to it. It's going to go in the U.S. mail. So it's a lot safer and a lot less prone to trouble than current voting systems, I believe.
That comes into play in local elections, the security of the ballot, because in some small elections, one vote or two votes can be crucial. It can swing either way. And, I'm glad that our local polling places are still paper ballots, because I worked in information technology over the years, and I know how reliable that is on occasion.
One thing I just learned, of course, I think I understand it. The Travis County election officer is Dana DeBouvois, and she just told, I don't know if she said it publicly, but she told friends yesterday that they're not going to have polling places in our grocery stores like Fiesta. And there's a good reason for it, which is like the workers in the store would be put at unnecessary risk. I actually kind of agree with that, but I don't know what the alternative is, Maybe outside the stores. I don't know. There's such a convenience, and people are so used to voting at the Randall's or HEB or Fiesta or whatever. I don't know how, and they're large facilities, so they can accommodate long lines, et cetera. I don't know what the alternative is yet to find out.
Yeah, that'll be rough for sure.
Maybe libraries. Nobody ever goes there.
Well, think of that's pretty funny. That's a really good. Actually, we have voted here where we live in the 04 here in Austin. We have voted at that library over there on South 5th Street before.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking, another places that have been used as polling places are nursing homes. And they're not going to be polling places this time for rather obvious reasons, I think.
I would think so.
We'll have to see how they deal with this location challenge.
I'm in the 04 too. Look at us.
How about that?
So you got Chip Roy too?
I'm afraid so.
Lucky us.
One time I read, I'm not going to brag on me and Susie about, but I am going to brag on us, because there was one measure in the Statesman years ago, which this was the 04 was the most literate zip code in Texas, and one of the top ones in America, right? And we had flat earther Lamar Smith as our congressman because of redistricting for a while, and now we have Chipper Roy.
Well, we couldn't find Lamar Smith for so long. We put him on a milk carton, but he still never showed up.
It's embarrassing, I'll tell you. Embarrassing. Another reason redistricting is important, and it's coming up maybe in 2021, though now they think the census delay may delay redistricting.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So we have to wait and see how that develops.
Oh, wow. Well, that's
sooner or later they're going to pass a law that says that only Republicans are allowed to vote anyway. So.
Yeah, they're getting close.
We're pretty
One
much
party
there.
state.
I want to give a 5-minute warning. We've got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So, Glenn, what
Yes,
haven't you said that you need to say in our last 5 minutes?
Wow. I have no idea. We've covered a lot of territory.
We have.
That's true.
I suppose if I was going to want to keep talking about something, it'd be this issue of trust amongst us. As one of the reasons, for instance, that I think this racial justice movement is so important is it's a chance to build solidarity across demographics. And we have to be up there and show that. Those of us who grew up like I did in a certain level of middle-class white privilege. I mean, the cops poured my whiskey out instead of busting me a time or two back when I was in high school and college, I got that benefit. I think it's time we have to hang together. We're either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately, as the old saying goes, right? And it all depends on trust. And so we have to demonstrate the trust. We have to take the risk with other people. And not just us here today speaking, but I mean everybody. We got to step out. We got to use empathy to connect with others and give them the opportunity to trust back in all kinds of settings. And we got to be honest. We got to be honest in the simple financial transactions, like at the grocery store. Don't cheat the cashier. Don't, show them some respect. Wear a mask, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
What a sign of respect and concern for others is wearing a mask right now. It's a visible thing we get to all do. I put on a mask and I am telling the world, I care about your life and your health. Right? So let's do more and more of that and build up some trust, which is the best way to resist authoritarian designs.
So the biggest problem I see right now, especially with the election coming up, is the lack of trust and the real contention between what you might call the independent left and Democrats. People who you might have thought of as Democrats, and a lot of them were Bernie supporters, but now they're saying they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. Some of them are doing like never Biden, similar to never Trump. And there seems to be no real possibility of dialogue. At least there's no dialogue happening between those people and the more traditional Democrats that Biden sort of represents.
So let's take my 3-step process and apply it to them right quick, right? So the first thing is I've got to respect their feelings, right? I got to acknowledge that they're there, they're real, that's the way they feel, they're not making that up. I've got to acknowledge that. If I'm going to speak with them, I've got to do that first. Secondly, I got to get to the facts to discuss the facts, right? And I got to tell the truth about it. And they've got points. And so, I mean, some points that some of those that you refer to as sort of the independent progressives, I guess, they've got darn good points about the surveillance state, for instance, right? We got to pay attention to that. They got a great point about the need for a single payer Medicare for all. We need to listen and acknowledge that we're listening, right? And then we've got to give them a new avenue for hope, that it all doesn't depend on whether their candidate got beat by Joe Biden in the primary or not. There's another pathway for hope, and they should be open to it. So that's one way of doing it. I add one thing to that, and I was talking to a group on that side of things just a while ago. This is personal to me, and I don't ask that everybody follow it, but like on the question of the demand for Medicare for all or Medicare as an option, right? To me, Medicare for all would be my political victory, right? Like I would love to do that. I'd love to take credit for making that happen because I think it's kind of, but I'm fighting in that victory, but I'm asking these people unrelated to me to risk the failure at the risk of their own health when I could do more limited but incremental steps towards getting them better health care on the way to that. And I don't ask them to risk their health on behalf of my particular vision, right? So it's kind of a moral principle I try to follow, which leads me to think like, okay, let's have a option, Medicare option. You can buy it if you want. And ultimately that'll lead to Medicare for all. But anyway, that's a little mental or moral trick I'll play to try to stay on the straight and narrow path.
Good one.
Cool. Well, this is probably a good stopping point for us here. We've sort of reached the end of our time. Glenn,
Thoroughly
thanks for
enjoyed it.
joining us.
Thank
Thoroughly
you
We
so
got to
enjoyed
do
much.
this a long time ago, and I'm glad. Thanks to Susie for making sure this happened.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you were able to sit with us, Glenn. I love talking to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Susie, and everybody. I've really enjoyed it. I hope to do it again soon.